I am pleased to introduce my friend of more than 30 years standing, Betty Jean Steinshouer, also known as Willa Cather, Marjorie Rawlings, Laura Ingalls Wilder, and on and on and on. But she's not wanted in every state under all of those names. But she's wanted here today because she has had the longest career of portraying Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings and meeting interesting people associated with Rawlings and going through all the kinds of adventures that make reading the daily newspaper a hair curling experiment in our later years. So Betty Jean, would you start by telling us why and when you started portraying Marjorie Rawlings?
It was March of 1989, and I came to Florida on a 10-city tour with Willa Cather Speaks. I was only in my second year of touring with that show, and the way I did my marketing in those days was to go to the library and get out a big library directory and send postcards to the librarians, and are usually friends of the library, of all the cities that I liked. The only time I'd ever been to Florida was when I was in grad school in Virginia, and we came down to Daytona for spring break one year, and I fell in love with it. I had seen the Gal Youngin movie at the Key Theater in Georgetown when I lived in D.C. I didn't know much about Marjorie, but I was real curious about that woman in the movie. You know, the one who lights the fire at the end? Yeah, I wanted to know more about her. So I actually stopped and stayed in one of those fish camps. In those days, they still had fish camp cabins for rent around the creek. And it rained harder there than I'd ever seen it rain in my life. And as I went around the state, I started out in Defuniak Springs, Blountstown, Crawfordville. I'm still very good friends with all those librarians who brought me in. But the group that wrote the Humanities Council grant that got me here in the first place was the Friends of the St. Johns County Library. And I was destined to know you, because she said to me, if you leave Florida without meeting David Nolan, you will never forgive yourself. She said, you may not know the significance of this gift.
Well, that's true.
Yep. And Maureen Welch knows it, but she speaks to this day, I'm sure. So I take her always.
Where were you from, since you didn't grow up in Cross Creek?
I'm the 10th of 11 kids. I grew up on a dirt farm in Missouri. I'm the only one in my family who ever went to college. And that's why I'm so fond of the Tampa 3, the Tampa 2, because teachers, I have no idea where I would be without my teachers. They saw that I needed to get out of there. They wrote me scholarship letters. They goaded me until I became valedictorian, and they got me through. And it's been such a wonderful ride. But as I was going around to those 10 cities, in 8 out of 10, people came up to me and said, would you please do our author next? And it didn't take many questions before I knew they were talking about, Marjorie, because the way I was wearing my hair is Willa Cather in those days, and I was about 40 pounds lighter, and they really did look a lot alike. So people could look at pictures of me in Willa Cather's midi blouse and see me as Marjorie. And I had some pictures I wish I could show you. My original costumes were quite a bit more elegant than the old black velvet dress I wore out in the later years, because when you're doing Chautauqua, you don't get any kind of a production budget. And I got one tiny little grant to do Marjorie that paid for me to. I had to have one. There was a caveat. I had to have one person as a research assistant who had known Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. You had Norton, and he didn't want to talk to me. I could put questions to him through you. Adela was already writing her first book, so I looked into Desi.
And tell us about Desi.
Oh, and when I handed Desi that $300 check drawn from my account, she said, I never thought I'd make a dime for Marge. And of course, she took me out to eat on it. She spent it all on me, but man, she enjoyed that. Desi was the most remarkably open and also shut down woman I've ever known. She talked in code most of the time. She'd say something outrageous, and then she'd look at me and say, and you can do whatever the hell you want with that. Just daring. So I have sheets around here. I spent about 2 months on this trying to ferret out where in the world Desi got to be when Mike Gannon wrote his play. And Deborah and I talked about this, Flo and I talked about this. Flo looked up the original transcript so I could pore over it. And you have to understand some of Desi's code before, even reading the actual transcript of the trial. Is anybody here who's old enough, if Kevin were here, Kevin McCarthy, I think, helped orchestrate. One year they decided to actually reenact the Cross Creek trial. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And they wanted it blow by blow. It was horrible. And I finally said, could I just take a few scenes out? Just do the fun part. And I mean, how many of you ever met Desi? I'm sure there's lots of here. Okay. Well, you heard her talk, right, as she really talked. So there was sometimes things that you wouldn't want to repeat or, just because she talked the way, an old cracker woman would talk. But I still haven't completely comprehended why and how arguably Florida's best historian could write a play based on fact, right? Have you heard Emerson's line that all history is biography? This proves it. Because there was something going on with Mike Gannon and Desi, and I don't think it was very favorable. Because I don't think he wanted Desi stealing the show. I think he thought if he put her out there with Zelma, and did you all get to see it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you saw. My friend Margaret she was so good, and Marjorie is going to be the star anytime. It's nice if she has lines, but she doesn't have to open her mouth, And the Phil May, you saw them last night. I wish you could have seen them on stage. Here's Sixby over here, just loud and obnoxious and wonderful, and Phil. You've heard the rumors that Phil was in love with Marjorie, right? It came through on stage. It was wonderful, didn't it? Anyway, so I didn't promise anybody anything, but I swear by the time I got back to Gainesville, I made a round of Florida. I went all the way down to Miami Day School, and I'm sure I can tell this now. The wife of the headmaster of Miami Country Day School thought that I really was Willa Cather. She had not read that Cather died in 1947. And I have to admit, I did not tell her any different. I did not, because, that would have been worse, right, I think. And then I went all the way down to Key West and got drunk with the librarian there, which made me remember always. And I did this huge, to me, it was a lot of driving. I got back to St. Augustine, and I told Maureen what everybody had been saying, and she said, well, it sounds to me like you need to get over to Gainesville and look in those papers and see what you can find. So I went in, and this was too removed. Flo was still a little young, undergraduate school, yeah. And there was a woman named Carmen Herf, who went back, when I'm beginning to start research on a character, because, I can't write scripts when you do humanities Chautauqua. You have about 45 minutes of basic material, and then they open the audience for questions. I talked to Hal Holbrook when I first started touring, who was doing Mark Twain. He said, that would scare the bejesus out of me. He said, how could you do that? I said, come on, you're a Twain scholar. He said, I know, but I want anybody to know. I don't want anybody to ask me questions. And he said it was the most terrifying thing in the world. So I spent about, it was 1989, and my Rollins premiere was in the Orange Street Schoolhouse building in March of 1991, so it was 2 years. And that was, I was huffing and puffing. I actually knew very little about Marjorie, but I had to pretend that I knew everything. And that's what you have to do and just hoping nobody would trip me up. Hoping Norton wouldn't turn up, or, so it was amazing. But Marjorie, I thought it was going to be a regional thing for Marjorie, at least. And I got requests for Marjorie all over Arizona. The Arizona State Library brought me in to do Marjorie. And a woman in Salina, Kansas took me out in the parking lot to teach me how to smoke so I could look like Marjorie smoking. In those days, they let you smoke on stage, right? And I coughed through that parking lot trying to learn how to inhale and blow it. I think I almost got lung cancer doing that. But it was an amazing ride with Marjorie. And then when I started doing Gertrude Stein, then it was obvious that the connection with Cather, Rollins, and Stein was Hemingway. So when the centennial came around, Gene Trevy at Florida Center for the Book called me up and said, you've got to do something about Hemingway for this. So we did the three of them. It's the only way Willa Cather ever finally made it to Florida. Anyway, I go on and on. You have to stop me.
Oh, that's good. But how do you decide? It must be, it's a lot of preparation to become Marjorie or something, and then to go on and also become Stein and others. Did
you see how he did this, David? You should have had a career on TV or something. Isn't this the mark of a brilliant interviewer? Like, I totally lost whatever I was saying, and David picked it up and carried it. Just like Travis Kelce right across there. Because he picked it up, because that was exactly the story I was starting to tell. How I'm not a great actress. I did the method acting for a while. I carried that little handbook of the great Stanislavski around in my car. He got waterlogged several times. And my real talent is selecting material. And the thing you always ask for, whether you're at Harvard or Library of Congress or wherever, ask for the files that say poetry, speeches, and miscellaneous. Because there's where you're going to find, I see Ann nodding over there, you know exactly what I mean. Because by the time, I'm getting chills now, just goosebumps, she's talking about it. I think I drove into the parking lot, which was a lot easier back then, Flo. Man, I was able to park right up there. I mean, the only way you can park as close as I do now is if you've got Flo on your side, that she'll bring you. I can't tell you the number of times this woman has got me into the library when I'm feeling pretty good now, but about 4 years ago, I could not walk into the library. And Flo would get me in. She would bring me a parking pass or whatever she had to do. But in those days, I really didn't know Marjorie hardly at all. I knew Gal Youngin, that's all I knew. And when she brought this sheaf of just ragtag papers to me, and I read Having Left Cities Behind Me, which I didn't know had been published at that point. I read it in Marjorie's original hand. And it was like it was embedded in not just my mind, but my soul from then on. And then Mountain Rain.
Say it.
You want to say it? Well, I have to tell you a funny story. Ann Schoniker sitting right back there. She was forced to go to almost everything during the Centennial Tour. Remember the Centennial Tour? Ann had to be, she was in Micanopy when we first met. And by about 5 years, she'd sit in the back of the room when I said a poem, her mouth would move. She knew the poems as well as I did. So I would say, now having left cities behind me, turned away forever from the strange gregarious huddling of men by stones, I find these various great towns I knew, fused into one, burned together in the fire of my despising, and I recall of them only the things irrelevant to cities, murmurings of rain and wind, moon setting and suns rising. There was a church spire on a distant hill, clamorous with birds by day and stars by night, devout and singing. I have forgot its site, Boston or Rochester or Louisville. Of a certain city, all I can remember is wild ducks flying southward in November.
Oh, great.
That's your best one. That was published, but Marjorie was in so much demand during the heydays of the Florida Humanities Chautauqua circuit that I would get, my regular bookings through Humanities, and then I'd get little clubs calling me up. So one season, I think it was it was after the turn of the century, and Ann, this was before Ann had retired. I don't think that, when I started playing Gertrude Stein, Ann played Mabel Dodge Lujan to my Gertrude, but anyway, I was double booked. I was under contract to do Marjorie for the Humanities Council in the morning in North Fort Myers, or Fort Myers, I think, and the DeLand Farm Bureau had contracted me for that afternoon, and they couldn't change their meeting. I mean, it was, so I got, there's a picture of her somewhere on Flo's computer. I don't know if we brought one. A beautiful picture. I mean, Ann is the Mary Steenburgen of Humanities during a Marjorie. Stand up, Ann, so they can see you. I mean, she was, but dressed up like Marjorie. She was elegant, the orchid corsage, the pearls. I mean, I couldn't hold a finger, but she knew the poetry, and that's about it. I wrote a script for her, but they could tell, she wasn't the real Marjorie. So, but it was okay. We had a great time, and but those, Robert Frost and Marjorie were I don't know if they were bosom buddies, but they were very good friends, and they talked about poetry a lot. And Frost told Marjorie at one point that in order to be good, a poem has to be round. So I think that was one of her roundest. It was a sonnet, but there was one scribbled on the back of an envelope when she had one heart attack before she died, right? When she was in the hospital at the Harkness, there was an envelope. I'm sure you've seen it, Flo, where she had scribbled on the back on her bedside table or in bed. I don't know if it was a prayer or a toast. Knowing Marjorie, it was probably a toast, but it said, and I don't believe this poem ever had a title, and I don't know if it's ever been published except maybe in a journal article. I am not filled, I am not brimming over, There is room still for a field of bee-besotted crimson clover and a whippoorwill. There is space for a moon and the sun rising together for the flutes of quail. I have not had all that I can hold of April weather or autumn gale. To marsh fern and to curlews calling, I reach my cup. I lift it to rain, to dew, to wish stars falling. Lord, fill it up. Now, when I did it as performance, I felt duty-bound to say, this poem is not even oblong. Because, but it was still a really fun poem, and I ended a lot of performances with it because it was, especially if I was doing her at a particular age. Anna Deaver Smith, you know who she is? It was I was living in Washington, D.C. when she first started touring, and it was once said of her by a Washington Post reviewer that when she changed characters in those shows she did, her fingerprints changed. Oh. Isn't that wonderful? So I nobody ever said that about me, but I kind of had a fantasy that would be true whenever I would come out. Oh, and by the way, my Harriet Beecher Stowe show, if you're ever going to ask, if I'm ever going to God's Voice Against Slavery. David and I have known it. He knew it was going to be like this. All he had to do was wind me up, right? Just let me go. But I'll shut up pretty soon. Janine Farber convinced me to put together a Harriet Beecher Stowe show for the Fernandina Gathering in 2000. And I think I only had about a year. She gave me a little bit of money so that I could go up to Hartford a couple times. Anyway, it was in this building 25 years ago. Isn't that amazing?
Well, now, I remember back around the turn of the century, I stopped at the public library in Portsmouth, New Hampshire to use their Xerox machine. And there, right over the machine, was a poster advertising a forthcoming appearance by Betty Jean Steinshouer. I said, my God, this woman is everywhere.
It must have been in the summer, right? Yeah, summers I went to New Hampshire. I learned my lesson about touring Nebraska when I ended up in a snowdrift because Willa Cather's birthday is December 7th, right, D-Day. So, yeah, I learned to come to Florida. That was my whole reason for coming to Florida for the first one. And, I spent most of the first 20 years or so of my life as a scholar in Nebraska because of the Cather research. And then once I got a taste, it was like getting sand in your shoes. I really haven't ever. I spent 1 year homeless with just I wasn't homeless because I had my car. See, I'm trying out lines for friends. You didn't laugh at that. Let me try it again. I wasn't homeless because I had my car. Yeah? All right. If it doesn't float the second time, no. Okay, go ahead.
Well, now, one of the people you met in New Hampshire was the daughter of Maxwell Perkins.
Oh, my word. Roger Tarr knew Bert. Did anybody ever be this? Max had 5 daughters. And the one that I was lucky enough to meet she was a Willa Cather fan. Isn't that wonderful? I was doing a New Hampshire tour, because Willa Cather's buried in Jefferson, New Hampshire, and wrote my Antonia in a field overlooking, or with Mount Monadnock overlooking her. So I'm doing the free library in Claremont, Fisk Free Library, Claremont, New Hampshire. And this little woman, very thin, I just remember how thin she was, came up to me and said, I would love to have you for lunch. I would love for you to come and have lunch with me tomorrow. And I thought, well, this is kind of an odd invitation. But she said, I just admired Willa Cather so much. And my father was in the book business, and I just thought that, right? So she gives me her address in Windsor, Vermont, which is not very far from Claremont. It's just right on the state line. So I showed up this big, towering house. And we're talking Cather the entire time. She brought out this how really genteel people can put together a meal, and all it is really is a piece of bread and some lettuce and some meat and cheese, and it's the most elegant thing you've ever tasted. That's what Bert did. And so I'm walking through the house, and I keep seeing this familiar face with the nose, and gradually it dawns on me who her father is. And I go out to the car and I bring in, I think I had just premiered the Rollins show. I bring in the Rollins, the Mia Rollins in costume. And she started crying. Oh. And she said, she just couldn't believe the coincidence of it. And I can't tell you how many nights I spent in the house. One of my favorite cards from Bert says, Betty Jean, I watched you drive away from my door at 2 p.m. yesterday afternoon, knowing that you had no intention of stopping until you got to Lincoln, Nebraska. Now, that's the way I was in those days. I mean, if I had a show, I would drive. To this day, I still would much rather drive all night. But Willa Cather brought me Bert. She brought me Yehudi Menuhin, who was directing the Warsaw Sinfonia at the Kennedy Center. I sat in his dressing room in the Eisenhower Theater, and Willa Cather brought me not just Dick Cavett, but Dick Cavett's stepmother, Dorcas Hardy, who was grand dame of the Superior, Nebraska Parade that year. We wrote together, and she said, you tell Dick that I'm way funnier than he is, and because I've already told him that you're way funnier than he is too. But then Dick and I drank into the night. I never drank that much, I don't think. But just when I went to Oregon and toured for the Big Read, this was NEA, and you know how it breaks my heart. I cried all night when I saw that they were finally getting to NEA and NEH. There was a curly-haired man in the second row, and as I was exiting, this was at the Broadmoor in Colorado Springs, that elder place, he caught up to me and he said, Miss Cather, have you et? and asked me if I would have dinner with him. It was Kim Stafford, son of the poet laureate, and he's since been poet laureate himself. So she brought me Kim Stafford. So just astonishing woman. But later on, Bert was still living in the house in Windsor. She told me this wonderful story about her father, how he would tell her when she had a new sister. He would come pick her up and he would carry her around, sometimes carry her. They had this wonderful riverbank right outside their house. He'd carry her up and down. And then he'd just come in and he'd show her, he'd wait till there was enough light for her to see that there was something in this crib. He would just hold her over so she could never say a word. And that's how Max Perkins told his daughters if they had a baby sister. Just put her back in bed. She'd wake up and think, what was that? But she was putting together Max's letters. I helped her edit the volume of letters that David Godine published for her later, called Father to Daughters, and it meant the world to her to get that published. But Bert, I mean, sometimes you meet a research subject. I mean, Bert and Desi, I think, became the closest friends that I've had out of my research subjects. I love Maya Jania's granddaughter very much, but we didn't ever really become what you would call friends. But just the richness of, and being able to take something, then when I always should distinguish between the people that I've actually portrayed on stage and the ones who are in the book, because there's quite a variance. And I know you're going to get to Vincent, you're going to get to Malay eventually. But if he makes it, give David a standing ovation if he makes it to end the St. Vincent Malay. Set that as a goal. We're going to get around to that. Because the worst thing is when I interrupt you and then interrupt myself too.
Well, now, you not only did Marjorie, but you and Zora Neale Hurston traveled around together for quite a while. I remember you appearing at the Flagler College Auditorium in St. Augustine. Tell us some of the adventures there.
Did any of you ever see Phyllis McEwen do Zora Neale Hurston? You know that. Phyllis still lives in Tampa, I believe. I think it's okay for me to say she has long COVID now. I haven't gotten to see her in person in years, but we had a really fertile time together. We did a lot of our research together. Claude, do you remember us coming together to the room? May have been Frank when we were putting it together. And it was difficult because I didn't know that. I didn't know much about Zora at all. And there was going to be another picture I was going to show you. I drove all night. I've had stage 4 cancer since 2018. And in fact, I wore my pink shoes. The last time I saw you and Darian before COVID, I had done I couldn't do performances then because I couldn't stand up long enough, but I had done my Scribbling Women in Florida at the Leitner Museum. And Darian came to have breakfast with us, and you and Ann went to get the car, and I was hurting so bad I could not get these shoes on. Ann has pictures of David tying my shoelaces. That's a true friend, because I don't know many people who would tie your shoelaces for you just because you're hurting too much to bend over. A lot of people probably would, but not guess you out about it. I mean, you knew how much pain I was in. So those kinds of things, but what was your question?
About Zora Neale Hurston.
Oh, Zora, yes, yeah. So Anne, that you met, planned a wonderful birthday tour to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Rollins Society. I wish I could say I wasn't like this before I got cancer, but my friends know. I've always been like this. But yeah, so I can't use that as an excuse. Phyllis McEwen doesn't just know Zora Neale Hurston, she knows the ancestors. She knows not just the backstory, she knows, I've seen Phyllis get up and walk out on documentaries because they misrepresented Zora. I mean, she's absolutely true to her character. And we had a lot of struggles because I really wanted to believe those wonderful letters. Have you ever read the letters between Zora and Marjorie? There aren't many, and there are actually more letters about them to other people. But there was a priceless letter that Zora wrote to Marjorie about Cross Creek and about her chapter about Black people. And Phyllis said, "Come on, you know, we do this performance for a room full of Black people. I see Marcia grinning back there. You know, there's going to be totally different reactions than a bunch of white people." Zora was good, and in fact, she said on Florida Public Radio one time, "You know, come on, Betty Jean. I mean, we go around everything. You're not really my friend. I just go around with you because you get me work. Come on, you know, let's be honest." And it broke my heart. I had my friend Randy call from the panel and said, "Just broke it," because he knew Phyllis really well. So we had this dichotomy, and I couldn't tell her she was wrong, and she probably wasn't wrong. I mean, I wanted it to be a true friendship. And then, do you know Christy Anderson? She did a wonderful documentary of Zora. She discovered, this is why your research should never end. I know you know this, Ed. You go on and on and on. You're gonna be finding these people who, you know, picked up an old Kleenex of Marjorie's and she signed it or something. You know this. So I just kept on. Then I drove all night to meet Lois Hurston Gaston, because you know the Hurston cousins sort of take turns on who's going to represent the estate. They often don't get along, but that's okay because they all know Zora's heart and they all love Zora dearly. But there was something called a Race Amity Conference happening in Atlanta. Chrissy and Lois Hurston Gaston were on the program together because Christy kept going back and researching the things that she thought she had missed in her film, which was made at least 20 years ago. She found in the Baha'i scrapbook a picture of a bunch of white and Black people together, photographed looking like deers in headlights. Because this is Jim Crow. And even in Washington, D.C., that many Black people and that many white people should not have been together in the Congregational Church at 12th and G. And there is Zora, and there's her professor, Dr. Locke, right behind her. And the whole idea of race amity in 1923, this conference, the first one happened in 1923, 2 years after Red Summer, we're not just talking Klan lynchings, we're talking mob violence against Black people, right? And that's the atmosphere of this time. And the fact that Zora Neale Hurston was there were 2,500 people the first night, and I think then there were only 500 gone the next day, but I think that extra 500 came because it opened with a violinist playing that night who happened to be the grandson of Frederick Douglass.
Oh, wow.
So that's what got that extra. But there's still 2,000 people kept showing up, and they looked terrified that somebody was taking their picture, sitting white and Black together like that. So that started me on a whole new, I wanted to find out the story behind the night that Zora was arrested, how in the world she got out of prison without becoming another Sandra Bland. And guess who was right in the thick of it? Our Marjorie. Mm-hmm. So, and I would have gone to my grave never knowing that story if Christy hadn't found that picture. I wouldn't have had a prayer of finding it myself. Who hangs out in the Baha'i building?
You know, I remember Christy, who worked on that PBS documentary almost forever. And so, since it went over a long period of time, it included September 11th, 2001, when she was in New York City talking to people trying to raise money to make that documentary when the World Trade Center was attacked. I thought, that is really devotion and dedication.
Well, hearing her stories about that, you should get her to come and talk here at a conference sometime, because she's a treasure. And Listening, I went online and listened to some interviews between Christy and Lois before I did that all-night trek to Atlanta, because I couldn't afford a hotel room and I knew I had to sleep on my pallet in my van, but I did it. I was determined to meet her, and it made all the difference. I do have a new, I guess you call it a Florida talk about it. Close feeding them questions. You know, yeah. Or she's giving us our time frame.
Right. Thank God for directors on things like that. She said also, mentioned that the documentary is called Jump at the Sun, and you can still find it.
I think sometimes you can watch it on Prime. I think so. Is it on Prime, Ann? I think so. Yeah. I think you may have to pay a few bucks for it, but it's well worth it.
Now, there have been at least 2 people I've seen here at the conference wearing distinctive black t-shirts saying Marjorie, 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 spelled a couple of different ways. Now, you not only did Marjorie Rawlings, you also did the Marjorie who spells her name slightly differently.
Yes. Well, back in the days when, are you finished with question? All right.
Yep.
David, he passes me the ball. Back in the days when every season of Florida Humanities contained at least one Chautauqua event or tour, they were doing an Everglades City gathering, and Janine buttonholed me again. This is 2007. I think she gave me another. She believed in work being done in years. No more. I mean, here Marjorie Stoneman Douglas lived to be 108, and I was supposed to do all the research. Thankfully, Jack Davis had pried his way through the collection at the University of Miami before I got there, but. So she put me on. I said, Janine, I don't look anything like Marjorie. I mean, how am I supposed to be Marjorie Stoneman Douglas? She said, it's once up here. This is what matters. So get to it. And I really enjoyed doing Marjorie. She also was a poet. When she was writing her Miami Herald column, people nominated her to be the Poet Laureate of Florida, which she never wanted to do. But so again, when you start that research, you look at the poems, you look at the stories. If they gave, I know you've seen the file of Marjorie's speeches. She would cut her, piece of typing paper in half so she could stick it in her purse, and then she'd unfurl it when she went to give speeches. And so finding those treasures. But there's even more treasures in the University of Miami, except that they're all mostly clippings. And the reason for that is because Marjorie really didn't want anybody to know the real story of her life. And she covered her, I've gotten together, Carl Hyacin, knew her pretty well, Clyde Butcher, not all at the same time, but I've interviewed all of them, Jeff Klinkenberg, at least 3 or 4 other reporters, and Marjorie, with the Y, told each of them a different tall tale. And sometimes it was about simple things, other times it was about very serious things, but she just loved putting the fool over on, especially reporters. And she knew that she would never have lied about the real things. But her favorite foods, last time she had sex with a man, please. I noticed, people ask you, Jeff Klinkenberg followed me. I love Jeff dearly, we're Facebook friends, so you can tell him I said this. But he followed me into my dressing room one time. I was down to my slip. He was interviewing me about my Marjorie work then. I said, get the hell out. But they will do that. They will ask you the most insane questions and expect stuff out of you. Idella found this out when she was doing her book tour too, and I was one of the people asking the questions. So, I said to her one day, Idella, have you ever gone and read Marjorie's letters in Gainesville? And read, she would be saying one minute, every white person of conscience should take that word out of their, and the next minute she'd be calling Idella or sometimes even Zora the N-word. And the thing is, she wasn't doing it as an expletive. It was 1947 or whatever, 1950, and her language never truly matched her conscience or her heart. But Idella looked at me and she said, Betty Jean, Miss Rollins was always just a white woman. That summed it up. And yet she loved her, they loved each other, and finding those love stories and those, and you know better than anyone else, Norton's stories and all of the, and this man once proposed to me at a Rollins Society conference. I know, isn't that a wonderful memory? It's one of my favorite memories. Where's Darian? I'm warning you, Darian. You have to come to Tampa and see the show because I'm going to tell the story of when David Nolan proposed to me at a Rollins Society meeting.
Down on my knee.
He got down on his knee.
I can't do that anymore.
But tell them the rest of it.
And this was, we were keeping a death watch on Desi for that whole Rolling Society conference there. We'd be getting phone calls and and she died before the end of it, and the newspapers called in to get comments from the Rolling Society.
Yeah, I just been at Crystal River 2 days before that conference reading Blood of My Blood to her. And she said, oh, she laughed and laughed when she said Arthur would be late to his own mother's funeral.
But we have to do one last because we promised.
Okay.
And that's Edna St. Vincent Millay. Tell us your story. You did not portray her, but
No.
you have spoken memorably of her.
Well, there's a wonderful chapter on her in my book, and it will be published. I'm not sure it'll be published in my lifetime, but Anne has made me promise that I'll get it. And I do have, in fact, I went into my chapter, my Millay chapter last night, because I knew you'd get to it. I wasn't going to try to, I just didn't know, you never know when you sit down with David Nolan, or me, what's going to happen. No, Edna St. Vincent Millay had a lot of secrets. Some of them from her husband, some of them from her mother and her sisters. She was in love with a young poet in Jacksonville named George Dillon, which is why she had to come to Florida. She had she owned part of a racehorse, which wintered at Hialeah, which she could never tell her mother because her father was a horrible gambler. She owned Shaladon, who was the 1939 Preakness winner. They sang, "Oh, Shaladon, my Shaladon," instead of "Oh, Maryland" in Baltimore that year. But if you're ever writing a book or even just a newspaper article or anything, because of this man, I know that Edna St. Vincent Millay once spent the night in St. Augustine. There needs to be a plaque, doesn't there?
There needs to be.
And I'm telling you, she had friends. She had friends all up and down the Keys. Of course, the most famous story about her is when she went to Sanibel to collect shells and the Palm Inn burned all her sonnets. She had copies, they were in her head. And the St. Vincent Millay was the Taylor Swift of her time, okay? When she did poetry readings, people would call out the names of poems. The other thing Robert Frost said to Marjorie about poems is that a poem must be said, not read, which is why I committed all those poems to memory. But that long red hair, I'm just going to leave you with this. Imagine that on the tennis court, okay? Edna St. Vincent Millay was a crackpot tennis player, and her favorite place to play was at Stetson, because Stetson had these hunky-dory tennis courts. And Edna St. Vincent Millay flirted with everybody. Desi told me that Marjorie once said about Zora, when Zora comes into the room, the women hang on to their men and the men hang on to their women. But that was doubly true of Edna St. Vincent Millay. So she had she had this wonderful little husband who was a businessman. He had once been married to the woman. Remember the story about the women's suffrage parade that did upstage Wilson's inauguration? And there was a wonderful woman on a horse, Lady Godiva's house. That was Edna St. Vincent Millay's husband's first wife. And as Milholland, she gave her life to the suffrage movement. So, and Richard Eberhart once called him discreet with briefcase. And he just followed Vincent around. But when she came to Florida, she came for Shaladon, her racehorse. She came for seashells. She came to try to find that curly-haired poet that she had translated Baudelaire with. Never really worked out for it, but she had friends in pretty much every town. I'm still ferreting out we'll talk again about because we have to get the address. It's on, what street is it on? The house where she spent the night.
Melmar.
It's that, yeah, we will get that. It's in my chapter somewhere, but I was searching out the tennis courts because I wanted to be able to make sure I was remembering. There was also, somehow, Edna St. Vincent Millay drew men to her of all stripes. Musicians, artists, photographers, and there was a man who played cello in the Winter Park Symphony who was trying to woo her, and then he was one of her favorite tennis partners. And then there was someone else who taught in the music department at Stetson, and so she would come and play tennis with him. And seriously, they said she was a better tennis player than poet. But just imagine that long red hair flowing. She wouldn't bind it up, right? She wouldn't. She just had, and I love each chapter of this Scribbling Women book. It's taken me, it's probably going to be 30 years if I last that long. I've been working on about, Gary Marmino first put it in my head in 2000. So I've been working on it for 20, I don't want to think about it. But each chapter, and Malay's papers weren't really in order. You know what it's like to go try to, well, Nancy Milford had been carrying bags of papers out of the Library of Congress and just taking them home, and they finally got them back and got them cataloged. But I was looking, I called up Elizabeth Silverthorne one year and asked her where some of her wilder stories in her biography of Marjorie came about, and she was doing the same thing apparently. She was going to visit Norton and carrying out, she said, grocery bags of letters. And she swore she got them all back in, but it's really scary and frightening to know this. But I have outlived 3 generations of archivists at the University of Florida, and I don't know, Frank's still alive. Frank was a wonderful, wonderful archivist, and I feel so grateful to each librarian, archivist, scholar, because they really have to be scholars in order to have these papers. My one big failure in life is that I did not get Connie Mae Fowler added to this book. I just cannot figure out how to rope her in. You cannot rope Connie, and that wouldn't be fair anyway, but I badly wanted her to be in with these 3. I mean, she would have made a perfect baker's dozen, wouldn't she? Harriet Beecher Stowe, Constance Fenimore Wilson, Sarah Orne Jewett. I'm trying to get them in chronological order if they're coming to Florida. Laura Ingalls Wilder, Zora Neale Hurston, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, Marjorie Canan Rollins, and the St. Vincent Millay. Elizabeth Bishop, Rose Wilder Lane, she gets her own chapter. Rose was a wild one. And then Bishop, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, and Rachel Carson. And I badly wanted to tap Connie Mae on because of her book about the Gulf. After it may happen, I don't know, but I've given up on it for now. But all of the stories that come out of research, and I know I love looking out in the audience and seeing somebody who knows exactly what I'm talking about over there. Yes. Because you go and you think you found the story, and then like the story about Marjorie's wedding ring, which Norton felt guilty for throwing me off. I guess he was throwing me off, but I got it back. I got it right, I think. But the Lindbergh chapter has given me great sorrow. And one last thing, because there really is a Max Perkins connection here.
Okay.
The reason that Scott Berg wrote the biography of Lindbergh that won him the Pulitzer Prize is because when Reeve and her mother were deciding who to give their blessing to write an authorized biographer of Charles, they went and visited Bert, because of course Scott had written the biography of Max, and wasn't that wonderful, poetic, the choosing a Jewish biographer to write the definitive biography of Charles Lindbergh, and of course he won. I think he won the Pulitzer Prize. Yes. Mm-hmm. So that's, everything comes full circle, and if you're lucky enough, you get to do some of your final. I'm coming up to I think probably what will be my last year or two. I'm already in the 6th year of a 2 to 5 year prognosis. So every time I see David or talk to him, he says, you have another chapter. I think I'm coming up on, the ends of it, but I'm going to do one last step. There's these things going around. This is a tiny version of the flyer that's going to be going up in Ybor City. So this will be the behind-the-scenes story of my Huck Finn funeral, which David and Darian are part of, and I don't know what's in the room. I've been trying to rope Marcia in, but she's already filming up. If you want to read the backstory of Desi and the play, just pick these up, and because this is my new theory. I went through, I think, 5 versions of this between the time I heard it that Deborah was putting it on and St. Augustine again. So I'll be on my deathbed still looking things up and calling Flo and saying, Flo, could you please find this picture? I know it's there. Could you just find it for me? And she always does. Thank you. And thank you.
Thank you, Betty.